just 6 more weeks, and when everything is finalized, I'll leave him with an empty nest and vanish with you." Those were my wife's words to her lover in the video she deleted after accidentally sending it to me. They think I know nothing about that video or what they've been up to. I didn't confront them. I acted as if nothing had happened. 28 days later, with everything I have gathered, I'm going to make them pay a heavy price for what they've done. If you found this story today, I'm grateful you're here. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? Every response reminds me why I keep sharing. Note this story contains fictional elements added for educational and entertainment purposes. Any similarity to actual names or locations is coincidental, but what it has to teach you is not. The commute home from Caldwell and Associates usually ran 35 minutes on a clear evening. That Wednesday, the 6th of November, traffic on I-285 northbound was moving well thin for a weekday, the kind of steady flow that lets a man's mind ease into the quiet rhythms of an ordinary life. I was thinking about the Buckhead development deal, about a contract clause that needed tightening before the December signing, about whether to push my Friday call with Henderson to the following Monday. Normal thoughts. The thoughts of a man who believed without question that his life was exactly what it looked like from the outside. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 61 years old. For the past 30 years, I have been the senior partner at Caldwell and Associates, a commercial real estate investment firm I built from a borrowed desk in a midtown office building with windows that didn't seal properly and a name that meant nothing to anyone in Atlanta. I have been married to Sandra Caldwell for 27 years. Our son Ethan is 21 now, in his third year, studying economics at University College London, a fact that still carries a particular quiet pride every time it surfaces in conversation. We live on Morningside Lane in Ansley Park, in a house with wide front steps and oak trees old enough to remember a different city. I have driven home to that house every working night for more than 2 decades. That evening, I expected to do exactly the same. My phone lit up on this passenger seat at 6:47 p.m., a video message from Sandra. I assumed it was something ordinary, a clip Ethan had sent from London, or something she'd spotted online that she wanted me to see before dinner. We shared things that way, the small, everyday passing of moments that a long marriage accumulates, the way a house accumulates furniture. I reached over at the next red light on Peachtree Industrial and pressed play. What I heard stopped everything. "Richard won't know anything until Derek and I have moved the assets. Derek understands. We just need 6 more weeks." Sandra's voice. Steady, unhurried. The voice she used when she was in the middle of something and completely certain of the outcome. A man responded from somewhere farther back in the audio, a voice I had heard across dinner tables and holiday gatherings enough times to recognize without needing a face to go with it. Troy Simmons, Sandra's friend of more than a decade. A corporate attorney who had been part of our lives since Ethan was still small enough to fall asleep on the couch during the evening news. "Are you sure about the timing? 6 weeks is cutting it close if he checks the accounts." Sandra's reply came without a beat of hesitation. "Richard doesn't check accounts. He never has. That's the whole point." The traffic light ahead of me turned green. I did not move. A car behind me honked once, then a second time. I pulled to the shoulder of Peachtree Industrial and sat with the engine idling, while the remainder of the video played out 2 voices, continuing a conversation in the calm, deliberate register of people who had been planning something for a long time and saw no reason to rush. 3 minutes and 28 seconds. When it ended, I stayed where I was. I understood 2 things with complete clarity. The first, Sandra had sent this to me by mistake. Troy's contact and mine sit 1 entry apart in her phone, a single careless thumb placement, the kind of error that doesn't announce itself until the damage is already done. The second, what I had just heard, was not the sound of a marriage failing. It was a schedule. I screen recorded the video before I did anything else. Open the recording function. Press start. Play the video again from the beginning. My hands did not shake. 30 years of high-stakes negotiations teach you something about keeping steady when the stakes become personal, and whatever composure I had built across those 30 years, I needed every last piece of it in that parking lot. Sandra called 40 seconds later. "Hey, I'm so sorry, I was venting to my sister about work stress and I hit the wrong contact. Please just ignore that it sounds so much worse than it is." Her voice was measured, apologetic in tone but not rattled, the voice of a woman who had already mapped her next 3 sentences before the first one left her mouth. "No worries," I said. "On my way home." A brief pause landed between us. "Are you still there?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'm here." I ended the call and set the phone on the passenger seat. Outside, the Target parking lot continued its ordinary business. Headlights sweeping through the lot. A shopping cart clattering across the asphalt. A man in a gray jacket loading bags into the back of a pickup without looking up. The world proceeding without me. I played the video a second time, then a third. I was listening for one specific thing, not for more evidence, not for names I hadn't caught. I was listening for the words she had used. Not us, not feelings, not anything that belonged to the private language of a marriage, however damaged. The word she had used was assets, the vocabulary of ledgers, transfer documents, and planned financial exits. Not the word of a woman who had fallen for the wrong man at a vulnerable moment. The word of a woman with a methodology, a partner, and a timeline already in motion. I had spent 30 years in commercial real estate. I knew exactly what it meant when someone started a conversation with assets before anything else. It meant the assets were the primary object. Everything surrounding them, the marriage, the house, the 27 years, was the instrument. I sat in that Target parking lot for 22 minutes and did not call anyone. I let the information settle the way concrete cures, not by pressing it, but by leaving it completely alone long enough for it to become what it's going to become. Then I checked the screen, recording one final time. It had saved completely. 3 minutes and 28 seconds, clear audio, full timestamp. I pulled out onto Peachtree Industrial at 7:09 p.m. and pointed the car toward home. I had driven that stretch of I-285 10,000 times. I knew every exit, every lane shift, every place the road corrects itself after going subtly wrong. But sitting in that parking lot, with my wife's voice still carrying its weight somewhere below my sternum, I understood with the particular clarity that only arrives when there is nothing left to pretend, that I was about to have to navigate something I had never once prepared for, and that every single choice I made in the hours ahead would determine exactly what kind of man was left standing on the other side of it. The drive from Peachtree Industrial to Ansley Park usually takes 22 minutes. That night it took me 47. I did not take a longer route. I did not stop anywhere. I simply drove at the pace of a man who needed 25 additional minutes inside my own head before I was ready to walk through a door and sit across a table from someone who had no idea what I now knew. By the time I turned onto Morningside Lane, I had settled on one principle that I intended to hold for however long this required. I would not react. I would observe. The house looked the same from the street. Warm windows, the porch light. Sandra turned on automatically when she arrived home before him. The broad oak in the front yard, throwing its shadow across the driveway at a familiar angle. 26 years of pulling into this driveway. He sat in the car for 2 additional minutes before going inside. The kitchen smelled of garlic and white wine. Sandra stood at the stove, her back to him, a glass of Pinot Grigio on the counter to her right. She wore her hair up the way she always did when she cooked on weeknights, a loose arrangement that had never quite managed to look effortless, though it had always tried. She turned when she heard him at the door and came across the kitchen with the unhurried ease of a woman who had been doing exactly this for a very long time. She kissed him on the cheek. "Traffic was brutal tonight," she asked. "The usual," I said. He set his briefcase down beside the entrance. "Smells good in here. Chicken marsala. Give it 20 minutes." He took his seat at the kitchen table, the same chair he had occupied for dinner every weeknight for 2 decades, and for the first time in recent memory, he truly watched her. Not the glancing attention of a man comfortable in a familiar room, but the full, quiet observation of someone who has just learned that what he thought he was seeing and what is actually there are not the same thing. He tracked the confidence in her movements, the way she talked with her hands when she was at the stove, the small decisions she made without hesitation, when to add wine, when to lower the heat, when to refill her glass. He had always read her ease in this kitchen as a kind of contentment. He was reading it through a different lens now. Dinner was what dinner had been for the better part of 3 decades, 2 people at a table trading the ordinary accounting of a shared life. Sandra asked about the deal he had been steering toward a close for most of the autumn. "How's the Buckhead deal looking?" Marcus mentioned it might close before Christmas. "It's on track," I said. "Should be signed by the 15th. "That's good." She refilled her glass. "You've been carrying that one a long time." "Yeah," he said. "A long time." She talked about a quarterly review at her office, about a dinner she wanted to organize with friends in early December, about whether they ought to book flights to London to see Ethan after the new year. Richard answered when an answer was required. He ate the chicken marsala, which was as it always was when Sandra made it genuinely excellent, and he listened to her voice with the attention of a man cataloging something he understands he will not hear in the same way again. There was warmth in it. That was the part he hadn't expected to still be true, and the part that sat heaviest. After the dishes were cleared, Sandra said she was tired and heading up early. She paused in the kitchen doorway. "Don't stay up too late," she said. "I won't," I told her. He listened to her footsteps on the stairs, the familiar compression of the 3rd step, the sound of the bedroom door pulling closed. Then he opened his laptop on the kitchen table. He had kept the banking credentials stored in his memory for years, without much occasion to use them, the way you hold a combination that rarely comes up. He logged into the joint checking account first, then pulled up the joint investment account that housed their shared brokerage positions. He was not entirely certain what he was looking for. He was certain enough that something was there to find. He found it in the checking account's outgoing transaction history. 7 transfers over the past 3 months, each routed to an account number he didn't recognize, with no payee description that corresponded to any expense, subscription, or obligation he could identify. The individual amounts ranged from $8,200 to $9,500, every single one of them below the $10,000 threshold that triggers a mandatory currency transaction report under the Bank Secrecy Act. He noted that detail the way a man who has spent 30 years watching money move notices the specific shape of money that is trying not to be noticed. Someone had chosen these amounts deliberately. Someone understood reporting thresholds and had built transfers to stay beneath them. The combined total came to approximately $63,000, moved in measured increments to somewhere he couldn't trace from where he was sitting. He sat with that for a long time before he wrote anything down. The amounts taken individually would not alarm a man who wasn't already alarmed. That was the point. They were sized to stay below the surface, paced to avoid the pattern recognition systems that flag unusual activity distributed across enough time to read as routine. Someone had given this structure real thought. Someone had done the specific arithmetic of invisibility. He closed the laptop and went upstairs. Sandra was on her side, facing the window, breathing in the slow, even rhythm he had witnessed fall into thousands of times. He lay beside her in the dark and looked at the ceiling for a long time without approaching sleep, turning the same information over in the same silence the way you turn a stone to see what lives beneath it. At 2:47 in the morning, he reached for his phone. He typed into the notes application, November 6th. Video 328. Joint account transfers, 7 instances total approximately $63,000. Amounts structured below BSA reporting threshold. Destination account unidentified. Do not react. Do not assume. Get information first. He set the phone back on the nightstand and lay in the dark for another hour. By the time the first gray light began edging through the curtains, he had made one decision, not about Sandra, not about the house, not about the 27 years, about who he needed to call before he took any other step. It wasn't his attorney, not yet. There was someone else who needed to hear this first. Someone who he was beginning to suspect might already know more than she had chosen to tell him. I had not slept. By 4 in the morning I had stopped trying. I lay in the dark beside Sandra for another hour, listening to the house settle around me, the way old houses do in the cold, then rose quietly dressed, without turning on any lights, and left before the street outside had found its color. I was at my desk on the 22nd floor by 6:45. The cleaning crew was finishing the floors below him. His assistant would not arrive for another 2 hours. He poured coffee from the break room and sat at his window looking out at Midtown Atlanta as it assembled itself in the early light glass towers, catching the first pale color of morning. The streets below still quiet, the whole city in that particular suspended state that exists just before the working day begins, and everyone commits to what they're going to pretend is normal. He had earned this view over 30 years. He had stared out from this window through the 2008 financial crisis, through the years that followed, through every major deal and near miss, and the moments when he wasn't sure the company he'd built would survive what was bearing down on it. He knew how this window looked when the world was manageable. That morning, it looked like someone else had built a tiny office and left him inside it by mistake. At 7:15 a.m., he picked up his phone and called his older sister. Carol Caldwell was 65 years old, 4 years Richard's senior, and had spent 30 years teaching English literature at a private high school in Buckhead before retiring 2 years ago. She had always been the most methodical person in the family, the one who read every page of a contract before signing, who researched a contractor's work history before letting him near a wall, who had once spent 3 weeks vetting a plumber. She had been calling Richard little brother since he was old enough to find it insufferable, which was somewhere around age 12, and had never once stopped. She was also the person who had known him longest most consistently, and whose judgment he had trusted without qualification for as long as he could remember. She answered on the second ring. I did not explain. He held the phone up and played the video. He listened to 3 minutes and 28 seconds of Sandra's voice filling my office, while Carol listened in silence on the other end. When it ended, there was nothing for long enough that he checked the screen to be certain the call hadn't dropped. 23 seconds. Richard. Her voice came carefully. How long have you had this? Since yesterday afternoon, he said. And you're still in the house with her. I needed to think first. A slow breath came across the line. Then, I need to tell you something. And I need you to let me finish before you respond. He said nothing. She took that as agreement. Carol had been at the Whitmore Foundation Gala on the 14th of March, a fundraising event at the Four Seasons Midtown that Sandra had attended, as Carol had understood it at the time, with a work contact. She had seen Sandra there with a man she didn't recognize. They were standing close together in the way that registers before. You can name what you're registering, the specific proximity of two people who have chosen each other, the small, almost imperceptible adjustments of position that carry meaning older than language. She had not known his name that evening. She had looked into it afterward. Derek Weston, business development, a health technology company out of Sandy Springs. I didn't say anything because what I had wasn't evidence, Carol said. It was a feeling, and a feeling isn't something you hand to your brother and then leave him alone with. Not without something real behind it. So she had done what Carol Caldwell did. When she had a question she couldn't answer, she had investigated. I hired someone in April, a private investigator. Discreet experienced 3 weeks of surveillance on Derek Weston. He came back without a single thing I could hand you. Derek was careful. Every meeting happened in professional settings, nothing that read as more than a business relationship on any record he could access. I was waiting until I had something solid enough to mean something. Richard had not moved since she began speaking. 22 floors below that the first pedestrians of the morning were appearing on the sidewalk, small and distant, and entirely uninvolved. After April, I did my own research, Carol continued. Derek left Meridian Bio in Houston, his previous company, under circumstances that no one discussed publicly. There was a legal matter. It was settled quietly, and whatever the details were, they were sealed well enough that I could only find the outline of something that someone had worked deliberately to make unfindable. She stopped. Then, Richard, whatever this situation is, I don't think it's only about an affair. He had been gripping the edge of his desk with his left hand. He let it go. 8 months, Carol. The 4 words sat in the air between them. Cy did not apologize. There is a kind of silence that functions as its own response, the silence of someone who has understood that an explanation would not reach the thing that needed reaching, and has chosen not to offer one. Carol had spent 30 years teaching students how language works and what it carries. She understood what silence carried too. I know, she said finally. I'll call you later, I said. He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. Outside the window, Atlanta continued its morning without him, traffic thickening on Peachtree below the neighboring towers, filling with people beginning their ordinary days. Carol had given him 2 things that morning. One was a piece of the past that had been kept from him at the moment it might have altered something. The other was a name attached to a Houston legal matter that had been resolved in deliberate silence, connected to a man who was currently, according to a video Richard had now watched 19 times, in the process of helping his wife move $340,000 out of a marriage he was still living inside. He needed someone who knew how to find the things that people put serious resources into making invisible. He reached for his phone one more time and looked up a number he had referred to other people for years and never once called for himself. After Carol's call, I sat in my office for 41 minutes without touching anything on my desk. It was not paralysis. I had spent enough of my professional life in rooms where the arriving information was worse than anticipated to know the difference between being stopped and needing to stand deliberately still. I sat by choice, the way you hold a document under better light, before deciding what it says. Carol had done exactly what a methodical, protective older sister would do with a suspicion she could not yet prove. She had hired a professional. She had conducted her own research. She had found the outline of something troubling attached to a name and a city and a legal matter deliberately sealed. And then she had waited for something solid enough to deliver, without causing a kind of damage that couldn't be walked back. The waiting was what he kept returning to. He thought about their father. Earl Caldwell was 84 years old and lived in the same house in Savannah where Richard had grown up. Same kitchen table, same back porch, same garden where Earl still grew tomatoes each spring with a patience that Richard had never fully inherited. Earl had spent his working life as a judge, 30 years of sitting across from dishonesty in every form it took, and he had come through it with a personal code that Richard had absorbed by proximity and example rather than direct instruction. One line of it rose now from a conversation in that Savannah kitchen, when Richard was in his early 30s, a moment he no longer remembered clearly, but which had lodged itself in him permanently. Richard, the moment you stop being honest about what you see is the moment you start losing. He had not understood it as a warning at the time. He recognized it as one now. Then he thought about Thanksgiving. 3 weeks ago, the last Thursday of October, the whole family around the long table at the Ansley Park house. Earl had made the drive up from Savannah. Terence had come in from across town. Carol had arrived with the sweet potato casserole she brought every year unwavering. Sandra had set the table with the good china candles in the holders she'd picked up in France on their 20th anniversary trip, everything placed with the careful attention she brought to occasions she considered worth marking. Carol had sat beside her, had refilled her wine glass without being asked, had laughed at something Sandra said about a restaurant downtown, had reached across during dessert to squeeze Sandra's hand at a joke that Richard no longer remembered. Carol had known all of it, had known for 8 months, and had sat there anyway, pouring wine and laughing. Richard pressed his fingertips flat against the edge of his desk. I did not press harder than that. He simply held them there until the thought completed its full passage through him. There was a knock at the open door. Frank Harmon, Richard's longest-tenured colleague, the man who had run the operational side of Caldwell and Associates for 12 years, with a quiet, undemanding competence that Richard had come to regard as one of the most reliable things in his professional life, stood in the doorframe holding a folder. "You skipped the morning briefing," Frank said. "Cover for me with Henderson," I said. "I'll reach him this afternoon." Frank studied him for a brief, measured moment, the particular look of a man who has decided a question is not his to ask, then nodded once and moved back down the hall. That was what Richard valued most about Frank Harmon. He understood the boundary between a problem he could help with and one that belonged to someone else entirely. Richard picked up his phone and dialed. "Hart and Whitfield, how can I help you? I need to speak with Vivian Hart. My name is Richard Caldwell. It's a family matter." A brief pause. "One moment, please." "Then Ms. Hart has a 9 o'clock available tomorrow morning." "I'll take it." He set the phone down. 9 o'clock. 14 hours from now. Between then and now, his work was simple: gather what he had, write down what he knew, and give Sandra no indication that the ground had shifted beneath both of them at the same moment. At noon, he took the elevator down and walked to Piedmont Park. He found a bench near the pond and sat for 18 minutes watching the lunch-hour runners move along the perimeter path, dozens of people in motion, earbuds in maintaining whatever forward momentum kept their particular days in order. He was not normally a man who sat on a park bench in the middle of a Thursday. He was not normally navigating this. He thought about Ethan. His son had called the previous Sunday from London, their standing weekly call Sunday evenings Ethan's time, and had spent most of it talking through a macroeconomics lecture that had apparently reshaped something in how he understood monetary systems. The enthusiasm in his voice had been entirely genuine, the specific energy of a young person who has just had a real idea and cannot quite contain it. Ethan was 21 years old, in his 3rd year at UCL building, the foundations of a life he had every reason to believe was stable beneath him. He knew nothing. Richard intended to preserve that for as long as the situation could bear it, long enough to have something coherent to say, and a plan already in motion when he said it. He walked back to the office and worked through the afternoon with the concentration of a man doing something familiar while thinking about something else entirely. He drove home at 6:15. The house smelled of takeout before he opened the door fully. Sandra had ordered from Watershed on Peachtree, his favorite restaurant, a place he had been going since before they were married, a loyalty so long-standing he had stopped thinking of it as a preference and had begun thinking of it as simply a fact about himself. The containers were on the counter, the cast-iron chicken he always ordered, the roasted vegetables on the side, a bottle of the specific pale ale he kept in the back of the refrigerator for evenings that weren't wine evenings. She still knew every detail of his favorite, without being reminded, without being asked. The care was real. He had no mechanism left for doubting that, not the care, not the 27 years, not the specific brand of attention a person accumulates only by paying it consistently over a very long time. And the betrayal was equally real, running underneath it, like a current beneath still water invisible from the surface, and absolutely present. He was learning in the compressed way that difficult circumstances accelerate understanding, that those two realities could occupy the same space simultaneously without canceling each other out. That coexistence, he thought, not the video, not the transfers, not the 8 months of Carol's silence, was the cruelest part of the whole thing. Tomorrow morning he would walk into Vivian Hart's office on the 16th floor of the Peachtree Tower. He had the screen recording the bank transfer records, and Carol's account of a legal matter in Houston attached to a man's name. What I did not yet have was any clear understanding of the financial structure Sandra had been building beneath the surface of their shared life, or how long it had been quietly taking shape before that video found its way to the wrong phone. The Hart and Whitfield reception area smelled like cedar and leather, the particular combination of materials that signals in certain professional environments that the people inside are accustomed to being taken seriously. Richard had referred clients here before, over the years. Corporate executives, business partners, people going through the kind of circumstances that require someone genuinely capable rather than merely credentialed. He had shaken hands in this lobby, made introductions, handed off business cards. He had never once imagined sitting in one of those chairs under his own name. The receptionist led him down a carpeted corridor lined with framed Georgia Bar recognition plaques and one large oil painting of the Atlanta skyline at night that he suspected was original. The corner office at the end of the hall had windows on two sides, Peachtree Street, below the downtown roofline beyond. The bookshelves that covered the interior wall held law volumes organized by spine color, and a single photograph framed simply that I did not look at closely. Vivian Hart was standing when he entered. 57 years old, silver threading through dark hair she wore, pulled back without ornamentation. A gold watch on her left wrist, and a quality of stillness in her posture that communicated neither warmth nor its absence. Only the particular authority that accumulates in a person who has spent nearly 3 decades managing other people's most difficult moments with professional precision. They shook hands. She gestured to the chair across her desk. "Mr. Caldwell, tell me what you have." He placed his phone on the desk without preamble and pressed play. Vivian Hart watched the screen for 3 minutes and 28 seconds. SI did not write anything. SI did not change her expression in any direction he could measure. When the video ended, she sat back slightly and lifted her pen. "Are you filing or reconciling?" she asked. "Filing," I said. "Good." She made a note at the top of the legal pad. "The certainty will serve you." He walked her through the remainder of what he had 7 bank transfers, totaling approximately $63,000, each structured below the $10,000 Bank Secrecy Act, reporting threshold routed to an account he could not identify. The name Derek Weston heard clearly in the video. Carol's account of the Whitmore Foundation Gala in March. The outline of a sealed legal matter in Houston attached to Derek's professional history. She listened through all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she reviewed her notes before responding. The video. Georgia operates under a one-party consent standard, OCGA Section 161162. Sandra recorded herself in the process of recording the conversation. That constitutes her consent. You received the recording on your own device without any improper action on your part. There is no credible argument that you obtained it unlawfully. She set her pen flat on the desk. In divorce proceedings, this is admissible as evidence of adultery under Georgia Code, and its evidentiary weight is considerable. But its value to you today is more fundamental than any courtroom application. It tells you the truth you needed in order to act, and it tells you clearly what you are dealing with. She turned a page on the legal pad. Here is what you are going to do for the next 4 weeks. You will not confront Sandra. You will not transfer any money from your joint accounts. You will not change your daily behavior in any way that signals to her that she has been discovered. You will continue to move through your life as it has appeared. That is going to be uncomfortable. It is also non-negotiable if we want to be in the strongest possible position when we file. What about the financial records? I asked. I'm retaining a forensic accountant who works specifically in marital asset concealment. I've used her on 3 similar cases in the past 4 years. The transfer pattern you've described is textbook deliberate structuring amounts kept below BSA thresholds, routed to an unidentified external account, distributed across enough time to avoid pattern flagging. Full forensic analysis will take 14 to 21 days. We will have a complete picture before we file a single document. There was a knock at the door. Courtney Walsh, Vivian's associate, late 30s, the kind of focused composure that suggests someone who has made precision into a professional identity, entered with a documentation folder and was introduced briefly. She reviewed with Richard what records to preserve, how to maintain them, without alerting Sandra, and what categories of communication to begin archiving. The exchange took 10 minutes. She left quietly. When the room was theirs again, I asked the question he had been carrying since Wednesday evening. What if I'm not able to remain in the house? Vivian did not rush her answer. That is a personal decision, Mr. Caldwell, not a legal directive from TMI office, and I will not make it on your behalf. If you choose to leave, notify me before you do. Document the date. Document your stated reason and understand the legal reality clearly. Georgia's equitable distribution standard does not automatically penalize the spouse who voluntarily vacates the marital home. Your ownership interest and your rights to the property's equity are not diminished by your physical absence from it. What leaving does carry is a narrative that opposing counsel will likely attempt to frame to their advantage. I want you clear on that possibility, not frightened by it. She looked at him directly. Only you know whether 4 more weeks inside that house is something you can manage. I can give you the parameters. The choice belongs to you. I nodded. He had expected her to push back or to discourage him, or to add qualifications that shifted the weight of the decision back onto legal strategy. Instead, she had simply handed it back to him cleanly. That he found was more useful than reassurance would have been. Vivian set her pen across the legal pad with the deliberateness of someone closing a thought. In 28 years practicing family law, Mr. Caldwell, the men who walk into TMI office and lose control of their own outcomes are without exception the ones who act before they have thought. They are emotional before they are strategic. They confront before they hold leverage. You sat with information that would have broken most people's composure for 24 hours before you called TMI office. You've already done the harder thing. Now let's make certain that advantage holds for the next 4 weeks. He took the elevator down and stepped out onto Peachtree Street into November air that had gone cold overnight. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting his coat, registering what he was now carrying. A legal strategy, a defined timeline. A forensic accountant beginning Monday, and a woman on the 16th floor who had handled situations like this before and communicated that fact without drama. His phone buzzed. Sandra. Dinner tonight, thinking of cooking. He typed back without hesitation. Sounds good. Home by 6:30. He pocketed the phone and walked toward the parking structure. 26 days remaining. The plan existed. The pieces were beginning to move. What I did not yet have, what no amount of preparation could supply until the forensic accountant finished her work, was any clear sense of how deep the structure went, or what it was going to look like when someone finally laid all of it out flat on a conference table. Vivienne had given him 4 weeks. He gave himself 4 rules: observe, document, stay present, and do not react. Those 4 rules became the architecture of every day that followed. He repeated them in the car each morning on the way to the office. He repeated them at night before he went to sleep. He built his behavior around them, the way you build a structure around a frame, one deliberate choice at a time. Nothing improvised, nothing left to the unreliable territory of whatever he actually felt. The mornings were the most technically demanding. Sandra came downstairs between 6:30 and 6:45, by which point he was already dressed, already on his first coffee, already running through the mental checklist of whatever the day required. He had been making 2 cups every weekday morning for 27 years, filling hers first, leaving it on the counter, where she always stood to check her phone. That habit had lived so deep in him it had never required thought. Now he made the 2 cups deliberately, consciously, as a chosen act rather than an automatic one, and the difference between those 2 things was something he felt in his hands every morning. She would kiss him on the cheek on her way to the counter. He would hand her the coffee. "Have a good day," she would say. "You too," he would answer. 27 years of that exchange. It had always felt like warmth. What it felt like now was a stage direction he had memorized. On the evening of November 13th, his phone buzzed with a text from Troy Simmons. Troy was 54 years old and had been Sandra's closest friend for more than a decade. A corporate attorney with an office in Buckhead and the particular social ease of someone who had spent his professional life knowing the right people and ensuring they knew him. Richard had sat across from him at dinner tables and holiday gatherings for years. They had never been close in the way that required much from either of them. The message read, "Hey man, hope everything's good with you two. Tell Sandra I called." Richard read it 3 times before he responded. It was not a friendly check-in. The specific phrasing, "hope everything's good with you two," was the phrasing of someone who already knew something might not be. And the instruction to tell Sandra he had called was not the request of a man who couldn't reach her directly. It was information being relayed to Sandra through Richard, designed to read as casual, while carrying a question underneath it. Has he seen it? Does he know? He typed back, "Will do. Hope you and Yvette are well." Cheerful, unbothered. The text of a man with nothing on his mind. He set the phone down and went back to what he had been reading. The weeks produced their own particular texture. He attended a partners' meeting on the 14th and gave his full attention to a zoning dispute in Decatur that under other circumstances he would have found interesting. He took Sandra to dinner on the 16th at a place she liked in Virginia Highland and spent 2 hours being a husband who was present. He answered emails. He reviewed contracts. He drove to and from the office along routes so familiar they required no decisions from him, which was useful because his decision-making resources were being consumed somewhere else entirely. One Tuesday morning in the 2nd week, Frank Harmon placed an additional coffee on Richard's desk without being asked and without saying anything. He simply set it there and kept moving. It was a small gesture, the kind that registers only because of its precision, the way it arrives without preamble or explanation, the way it says everything it needs to without requiring a word to be spoken. I sat with that coffee for several minutes before he drank it. It was the closest he came during those weeks to losing the composure he had been maintaining at considerable cost. He thought often about a Thursday evening in October, 3 weeks before the video arrived. A corporate networking event at the Intercontinental Buckhead, the kind of function that Richard attended out of professional obligation rather than any preference, the kind of room that was useful to be visible in. Sandra had come with him. She was good at these events, better than he was in certain ways. She moved through a room with ease, remembered names, made connections that occasionally turned into something useful. She had stopped beside him about an hour into the evening and said with the natural ease of a woman making an unremarkable introduction, "Derek Weston, industry contact, very sharp." The man who turned from the adjacent conversation was 45, compact and well-dressed, the kind of tailored confidence that comes from knowing exactly what impression you are making. He extended his hand to Richard with a direct, unhurried gaze. "Good to meet you," I said. "You as well, Mr. Caldwell. I've heard good things about your firm." They spoke for perhaps 4 minutes about commercial real estate trends in the Southeast, before the conversation dispersed into the general movement of the room. Richard had not thought about it again until now. He thought about it now in considerable detail. He had stood in that room and shaken the hand of the man who was at that very moment helping to systematically dismantle what Richard had spent 30 years constructing. Derek Weston had looked at him steadily, said the right things, smiled at the appropriate intervals, and given no sign whatsoever, none that anything was occurring beneath the surface of the exchange. He had been from every observable angle simply a man at a networking event. Looking back at it now, Richard also noticed the distance Sandra had maintained from Derek for the rest of that evening. Not avoidance, something more deliberate than that. A calibrated space close enough that it looked coincidental, managed enough that it never accumulated into something a casual observer might remark on. It seemed practiced, he thought, the way two people look when they've worked out exactly how much room to leave between themselves in public. He could not have said that with certainty it was an impression, not a confirmed fact, but the impression fit everything else he now knew. At midnight on a Tuesday, near the end of the second week, he stood at the bathroom sink and looked at himself in the mirror for a long moment. The man looking back appeared by every external measure completely fine. He had always been good at that. 17 more days, he said to the mirror, quietly, to no one. It was the first time he had counted what was left instead of what had passed. Something about that shift felt significant, though he couldn't have explained precisely why. There are things you see differently once you understand what you are looking for. He had been in the same room with both of them, had stood close enough to shake one of their hands, and had perceived nothing. That thought, more than the video, more than the bank transfers, more than the 8 months of Carol's silence, was the one that kept arriving on the nights when maintaining the performance required everything he had. On the morning of the 19th, Vivian called just after 8. Richard was already at his desk. He had been there since 6:50. The 2 weeks of routine had settled into him in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. Not exhaustion exactly, but the particular weight of sustained vigilance, the cost of being simultaneously two versions of himself and keeping both of them calibrated to the same performance. He was sleeping, but not deeply. He was working, but not freely. Everything he did passed through a second layer of consideration before he allowed it to become action. The call came through on his direct line. He picked up on the first ring. "The first layer is in," Vivian said. "We've identified an LLC Meridian Voss Holdings, Delaware registration. The ownership structure is intentionally obscured. The registered agent is a firm that specializes in privacy-protected formations. We know the name and the shell. We don't yet know who controls it. Can you trace who's behind it? That's what we're working on. Give us 5 to 7 more days. In the meantime, don't change your routine. Don't do anything that might signal movement on your end. Understood." A brief pause on the line, and then one more thing. "In the course of the research, we've encountered a reference to prior professional activity by Derek Weston that warrants further investigation. I would rather not speculate on its nature until we have something concrete in hand. What I will say is that the reference suggests this may not be the first time he has operated in this general manner." He let that sit for a moment before responding. "How long before you know more?" "The same window, 5 to 7 days. I'll call you when we have something worth discussing." She ended the call with her usual economy. Richard set the phone down and remained where he was for a while, looking at the city outside his window. Meridian Voss Holdings, a Delaware LLC with a privacy-protected ownership structure. The name combined two things: Derek's company Weston Meridian and Sandra's maiden name Voss. The combination was not subtle to him now, though he understood it had been designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for the specific connection. Someone had thought carefully about the name the way you think carefully about anything you intend to leave in plain sight. He worked through the morning on the Buckhead deal on a lease renewal for a commercial tenant in Midtown, on a call with a contractor about a renovation timeline that had slipped by 3 weeks. He answered every question directly and on point. He returned every message. He was by every professional measure fully present. At 2:15, his cell phone buzzed. Frank Harmon. "You missed the partners' lunch," Frank said. Henderson noticed. "Tell him I had a conflict. I'll reach him tomorrow morning." A moment of silence. The particular silence Frank used when he was deciding whether something warranted a follow-up question. "You good, Richard?" "Fine, Frank, I'm fine." Another of those silences. Then, "All right." Frank ended the call. Richard appreciated, not for the first time, the discipline it took for Frank Harmon to consistently ask the question and then accept the answer he was given, without pushing, without the kind of probing that would have required Richard to either lie more completely or say more than he was ready to say. Frank was extending him a kind of trust. Richard intended to be worth it. At 3:30, he got in his car. Weston Meridian Health Tech occupied a 6-story glass building on Peachtree Dunwoody Road in Sandy Springs, the kind of structure that exists in dozens across the northern suburbs of Atlanta, professional and anonymous in equal measure, surrounded by other professional and anonymous buildings and a parking structure that served all of them collectively. Richard drove the surface streets from Midtown rather than taking the highway, which added 12 minutes to the drive, and gave him 12 additional minutes to determine exactly why he was making this particular trip. He parked on the second level of the structure directly across the street from the Weston Meridian building and turned off the engine. He was not there to approach Derek Weston. He had no script for that conversation, no legal standing to initiate it, and no strategic interest in anything other than what Vivian had told him to do, which was specifically nothing until she said otherwise. He knew this. He was there because after 2 weeks of managing an abstraction, he needed to see the concrete reality of the person at the center of it. He needed a face to attach to the thing he was carrying. The building's main entrance was visible from where he sat. He waited. At 5:47 p.m., Derek Weston walked out. He was 45, and he looked it in the way that men look 45, when everything has gone more or less according to plan. A compactness to his frame that suggested he still paid attention to how he carried himself. A dark overcoat over a suit that fit well, Oxford shoes, in a dark tan that caught the parking lot lights as he moved. He was on his phone, speaking his stride even, and unhurried, a man with somewhere to go, who had never once had to calculate whether he had the right to go there. He crossed the lot to the near row and got into a white Range Rover. I did not look up. I did not scan the street or the structure opposite him. I did not have any visible awareness that someone was sitting 50 yards away, cataloging his existence. He drove out of the lot and turned north without hesitation. Richard picked up his phone and opened the notes application. November 19th, 5:47 p.m. White Range Rover. Georgia plate beginning RKJ. Dark overcoat, tan Oxford shoes. Even stride. Did not look around. A man who believes the plan is proceeding on schedule. He drove back to Ansley Park in the November dark. The house was quiet when he arrived. Sandra's car in the driveway, but no lights in the front rooms. A handwritten note on the kitchen counter. Picked up your dry cleaning. Steaks for dinner, your choice of wine. He stood in the kitchen holding the note. Sandra's handwriting. A small domestic act of consideration, the kind that costs nothing and maintains the surface of an ordinary life. He had been the recipient of these gestures for 27 years, without ever once examining what they were for. He was examining them now. The forensic accountant needed 5 more days. Whatever was sitting inside the structure of Meridian Voss Holdings had been moving for longer than he had known to look. 5 more days, and he would begin to understand the actual dimensions of what he was standing inside. Before I reveal the exact number Sandra had moved out of this marriage and the name on the documents that changes everything, drop a 8 in the comments right now. Just let me know you're still here with me. Quick note, The story ahead contains some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. If this isn't the kind of content you're looking for, you're welcome to step away. No hard feelings. Vivian called on a Monday morning with the quality of controlled urgency that Richard had learned to read in the 3 weeks they had been working together. Not alarm, Vivian Hart did not appear to traffic in alarm, but a particular compression in her voice that said the information had arrived and was waiting to be delivered. "Come in at 10, she said. "Courtney has the full picture." He was in the Hart and Whitfield conference room by 9:58. Courtney Walsh was already there, a structured arrangement of documents spread across one end of the long table, printed pages, flagged sections. A legal pad with organized notes running down its left margin, in handwriting, precise enough to have been typeset. Vivian came in at 10 exactly, and took the chair at the head of the table without ceremony. "Walk him through it," she said to Courtney. Courtney Walsh had the manner of someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect, and she delivered the findings accordingly. "Meridian Voss Holdings, LLC," she began. "Registered in Delaware on September 14th of last year, 14 months ago. The operating account is maintained through a Nevada-domiciled holding entity, which is a common structure for parties who want to create legal distance between the beneficial owner and the operating funds. We've now identified both." She turned a page. "The beneficial owner of Meridian Voss Holdings, the individual who controls and benefits from the entity, is Derek Weston. The signatory authority on the operating account, the person authorized to approve and execute fund transfers, is Sandra Caldwell." Richard kept his hands flat on the table. He said nothing. Courtney continued. "Over the 14 months since the LLC was established, 38 transfers have been made from your joint marital accounts into the Meridian Voss operating account. Each transfer falls between $8,000 and $9,500. She looked up briefly. "Those amounts are not accidental. The Bank Secrecy Act requires financial institutions to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000. The transfers were structured to remain below that threshold. Additionally, the amounts and timing were varied. No two transfers were identical in size, and the intervals between them ranged from 9 days to 23 days, which is consistent with an attempt to avoid triggering the anti-money laundering, behavioral pattern flagging systems that most major banks operate." She set the page down. "The total transferred to date is $340,000. The room was quiet. Vivian watched Richard. "This was not an impulsive decision," Vivian said. "The LLC was incorporated 14 months ago. The transfer pattern was established and maintained consistently across that entire period. At no point during those 14 months did the activity deviate from the established structure in a way that would suggest improvisation. What you are looking at is a planned exit that has been executing steadily while you were still inside the marriage." Richard looked at this number on the page in front of him. $340,000. He thought about the briefcase he had given Sandra for her 50th birthday. Dark brown Italian leather, her initials embossed on the clasp. The kind of gift you give someone you have been paying close attention to for decades. He thought about the morning she made eggs and toast before his biggest client presentation of the previous year and said, standing at the door as he left, "Go show them who you are." He thought about 38 transfers and 14 months and the specific calculation required to keep all of it below the surface of a life that looked from every visible angle entirely intact. I did not allow the full weight of it to arrive all at once. He had learned in the weeks since November 6th that this was a discipline, parceling what you could process in real time and holding the rest at a manageable distance until you had the capacity to receive it. "Is there anything in this material that connects Derek Weston to situations of this kind before Atlanta?" he asked. Vivian held his gaze. "We've found references that require further investigation," before I'm willing to characterize them to you. I don't speculate ahead of evidence. It doesn't serve you, and it doesn't serve the case. What I will say is that the references exist, and that we are pursuing them with the same thoroughness we applied to the LLC. She closed the folder in front of her. You'll have a full picture when we have a full picture. He nodded. He understood the correct answer. Not a reassurance, not a deflection, a professional commitment to the standard she had told him from the beginning she intended to maintain. Courtney Walsh collected the documents back into their folder with the same quiet precision she had brought to spreading them out. Vivian walked him to the elevator herself, an unusual gesture that he noticed and said before the doors opened. 9 days remaining. Don't change anything. He drove north from downtown through the late morning traffic, not toward the office, but toward Ansley Park. He wasn't sure entirely why he had made that turn. He had not planned it. He found himself on Morningside Lane without having consciously decided to go there. He parked at the curb and turned off the engine. The house sat back from the street the way it always had, wide front porch, the oak tree dropping its last November leaves across the lawn, the kitchen window lit from inside where Sandra was home. 26 years of returning to that house. 26 years of believing without examination that what he was returning to was exactly what it appeared to be. He sat at the curb for 4 minutes. I did not go inside. I did not need to. $340,000, 38 transfers, 14 months, while he was signing the mortgage renewal that had kept Ethan's future stable, while he was wiring the tuition payments that had put his son in a lecture hall in London, while he was sitting at the kitchen table, eating the meals she prepared, and believing with the complete and uncomplicated trust of a man who had no reason to look closer that he was building something that would hold. He put the car in drive and headed back toward Midtown. 9 days remaining in the performance. Before he could face what was waiting at the end of those 9 days, there was one person he needed to be with, not for legal strategy, not for professional counsel, for something that predated all of this by 60 years. He would make the drive south next Sunday morning toward Savannah. There are things a man cannot put into a text message, cannot work through in the middle of a week, when other people still need him to appear fully in command of himself, cannot bring to anyone whose perception of him has to remain intact for practical reasons. By the time Sunday arrived, Richard understood that the full picture now sitting in his possession, $340,000, 38 transfers, 14 months, his wife's signature on the operating account of a Delaware LLC controlled by another man, was more than he could hold adequately on his own. So on Sunday morning he drove south. Sandra was in the kitchen when he came downstairs with his jacket. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Driving down to see my father. Need to check on him." She nodded without particular interest, refilling her coffee. "Tell Earl I said hello." "I will," I said. He got in the car and pulled out of Morningside Lane and didn't stop until he reached I-16 West toward Savannah. The normalcy of that exchange, 4 sentences, 2 people Sunday morning, was the most unsettling 4 minutes of the entire week. The drive to Savannah ran a little over 2 hours on clear roads. I did not turn on the radio or connect his phone to the car's audio system. He drove in the kind of deliberate quiet that he had been seeking unsuccessfully since November 6th, the specific quality of silence available only when you are physically removed from the environment where the problem lives. He watched Georgia pass outside the windows. The flat stretch of I-16 through pine and farmland, the land leveling out the farther south he went. The sky widening the particular palette of a Georgia December morning, gray-white and still. He thought for most of the drive about nothing specific. He let the road do the work. Earl Caldwell lived on Abercorn Street, in a house he had occupied for 41 years, a 2-story frame structure with a deep front porch and a back garden that he maintained with a consistency Richard had always found quietly extraordinary. Earl was 84 years old. He had served as a circuit court judge for 22 years, had buried his wife 11 years ago, had outlived several of his closest friends, and had never once, in Richard's observation, allowed any of those things to diminish his capacity for the particular calm that comes from having made peace with the terms of existence. When Richard pulled into the driveway, his father was in the back garden. He could see him through the side gate, moving slowly along the raised beds, his hands in canvas gloves, clearing out the spent growth of the fall season and turning soil for what would come in spring. The garden was Earl's anchor in retirement, the same way the law had been his anchor before it. Earl looked up when he heard the gate. He looked at his son's face for about 3 seconds, a specific measuring look that Richard had known since childhood, the one that said the information had been received and processed before a word had been spoken. Earl pulled off one glove and pointed toward the 2 wooden chairs on the back porch without saying anything. They sat. Earl set the gloves on the porch railing and looked out at the garden. Richard told him everything. Not the legal structure, not the forensic accounting, not the strategy. Vivian Hart had built across 5 weeks of careful preparation. The truth of it, the shape and weight of what it actually was, to know what he now knew. The video, the transfers, Sandra's name on the operating account, the 14 months, the performance of the past 3.5 weeks, the particular cost of lying beside someone at night while carrying the full knowledge of what they had been doing in the daylight. Earl did not interrupt. I did not look at Richard while he spoke. He looked at the garden, at the bare raised beds and the turned soil and the dry grass edges where the season's growth had been cut back. He waited until Richard had finished completely before he said anything. When your mother got sick, Earl said, I had every reason in the world to be angry. At the diagnosis, at the doctors, at whatever order of things arranges for a woman like that to leave too early. I had every reason, and some nights I felt every one of them. He paused. Every morning I had to choose between being the man I wanted her to remember and the man I actually felt like becoming at 4 a.m. Those are not always the same man. Most mornings, they weren't even close. Richard listened. What does Vivian say? Earl asked. Maintain, then maintain. They sat in silence for a while after that. The yard was quiet. No traffic sound reached this far back, only the occasional movement of a bird, somewhere in the bare oak at the garden's edge. Richard had grown up visiting this house. He knew the sound of it better than almost any other place in his life. Before he left, Earl stood from the chair with the measured, deliberate care of a man who has learned not to rush his own body and placed one hand on Richard's arm. His grip was still firm. The thing they're trying to take from you, he said, is not what they think they're taking. They think it's the money. It isn't the money. He let go. Don't give them the rest of it. Richard drove back north in the December dark, with both windows cracked despite the cold. The heat in the car was running, which made no sense and which I did not correct. He needed the air. 10 days remaining on the performance. He knew what was waiting at the end of those 10 days, the confrontation he had been building toward since a parking lot on Peachtree Industrial, the morning he had been preparing, since before he fully understood what he was preparing for. What I did not know yet was that 2 additional things were already moving toward him before that morning arrived. One was coming from inside Sandra's professional world. The other was traveling across an ocean from a dormitory room in London, carried by a 21-year-old who had been holding a piece of this for longer than Richard knew. Of all the 26 days, the 22nd was the hardest. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. The 3 days after Savannah had passed, the way the rest of the performance had passed, in the deliberate motions of a man maintaining a character he had constructed out of necessity. Coffee in the morning. The office. Dinner. The notes document on his phone growing one entry at a time. He had not heard from Vivian since Monday, which she had told him to interpret as the absence of news rather than the absence of progress. He had interpreted it accordingly and continued moving through his days. The anniversary fell on a Wednesday. Sandra had made the reservation at Bacchanalia. She mentioned it 3 days before, with the ease of someone who had been thinking about it, who had chosen the restaurant the way she chose most things, with attention to what she knew about the person she was choosing it for. Bacchanalia was Richard's kind of restaurant, quiet enough for actual conversation, exceptional food, the kind of place that took the meal seriously without making the surroundings feel like a performance of wealth. He had been going there for 15 years. She knew that. He dressed that evening in the dark suit she had always said she preferred on him and drove them there in the Lexus through November traffic that moved in the slow, companionable way of a city settling into a holiday week. Thanksgiving was 2 days away. The seasonal lights on Peachtree were already up. Sandra was warm throughout the meal in the way that she was sometimes genuinely disarmingly warm, interested in what he was thinking, asking the kinds of questions that a person only asks if they have been paying attention for a long time. She asked about a deal he had mentioned in passing 2 weeks ago. She remembered the name of the contractor he had been frustrated with in October. These were not manufactured details. They were the accumulated observation of a person who had been watching him closely for 27 years. "Do you remember what you said on our first anniversary?" she asked during the second course. He thought about it honestly. "I said I'd never had a year go by that fast. You said you couldn't imagine what the next 26 looked like." She turned her wine glass slightly on the table. "I've been thinking about that." "So have I said. He meant it differently than she did. Both of them knew in their separate ways that something had already shifted irreversibly. Only one of them knew why. Between the main course and dessert, Sandra reached into her bag and set a flat box on the table between them. Dark blue, no larger than a paperback, tied with a single ribbon. SI did not make a production of it. She simply placed it there and waited. Inside was a Patek Philippe Calatrava white dial brown leather strap, the case catching the candlelight in the way of well-made things. He had pointed to an image of one in a magazine 3 years ago, a moment of idle admiration that he had forgotten by the time he turned the page. She had not. Sandra placed her hand over his on the table. 27 years, she said. "I'd choose you again." Richard looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for weeks thoroughly, without the softening effect of habit, trying to find the seam between what was real and what was constructed. "I did not find it." That was the part he had not been able to prepare himself adequately for. There was no visible seam. Whatever she felt for him, and something in her did feel something he was no longer capable of doubting, that it ran alongside everything else without apparent contradiction. Two things simultaneously true in the same person. He was still developing the vocabulary for that. "Thank you," he said. "It's beautiful." He fastened it to his wrist. It fit well. Of course it did. They finished dinner in the way of people who have shared enough meals together that silence is not a problem. She talked about a colleague's upcoming retirement. He listened, contributed where contribution was natural, and did not perform more than the occasion required. He had learned over these weeks, a better actor than he would have previously credited himself. In the parking structure afterward, Sandra took his arm the way she had taken it on hundreds of walks and evenings across 27 years. The specific, unthinking ease of a gesture that has been made so many times, it no longer registers as a choice. "I know this year has been hard," she said. "The Buckhead deal, all of it. I want you to know that I see that." "I know you do," I said. They drove home through the Thanksgiving week traffic in a comfortable quiet. The Patek Philippe sat on his wrist, through the drive, through the evening, through the hour he sat at his desk after Sandra had gone upstairs. He opened the notes application. November 27th, anniversary dinner. Bacchanalia. Patek Philippe Calatrava, white dial, brown leather. She said, 27 years, I'd choose you again. Documented. He set the phone down and sat for a while looking at what he had written. There was something he needed to name, even if only to himself. It was not hatred. It was not any longer simple grief. It was the recognition that he was mourning something that had not fully been what he had believed it was, which is a different and more complicated kind of loss than mourning something real. Grief and anger, he was learning, are not always distinct emotions. Sometimes the cruelest element of a betrayal is that the person who has betrayed you still carries the genuine habits of caring about you. That is not weakness on your part. That is 27 years of actual life shared between two actual people. Whatever else was also true at the same time. You don't dismantle 27 years in 22 days, even when you know everything you now know. The math doesn't work that way. He carried the Patek Philippe upstairs and set it on the nightstand. He looked at it for a moment before turning off the lamp. I did not wear it to sleep. 7 days remaining. Vivian had called that afternoon not about the LLC, not about the forensic report, but about a detail in Derek Weston's professional background that the additional investigation had flagged, and that she wanted 1 more week to fully characterize before she brought it to him. She would call when she had it confirmed. 7 days and then 1 morning that would close everything that had been open since November 6th. Before I take you inside that kitchen on the morning of December 4th, comment the word ready if you want to see what happened the moment Richard finally sat Sandra down with the truth. A quick note. Some elements in the story ahead are fictional, built purely for educational and entertainment value. If this isn't for you, feel free to stop here. I understand completely. On the morning of December 4th, I was up before 5:30. Not because I couldn't sleep. Because I was done waiting. I had slept actually more deeply than I had slept in weeks, the way you sleep when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you know that tomorrow you are finally going to set it down. I lay still for a few minutes in the dark, listening to Sandra's breathing beside me, then got up without turning on any light. I showered in the guest bathroom down the hall. I dressed in the closet with the door pulled shut. A dark navy dress shirt, no tie, charcoal trousers. Not a suit. This was not a meeting. But it was not a Saturday either in any sense that the word usually carried. I went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a moment before I did anything else. 27 years of mornings in this room. The same window, the same light fixture above the table, the same arrangement of the counter space that we had arrived at sometime in the first year and never changed. I looked at all of it with the deliberate attention of someone memorizing a place they understand they are leaving. Then I made 2 cups of coffee. I made 2 because I had made 2 every morning for 27 years, and because making only 1 would have been its own kind of signal, small, preemptive announcing what was coming before I was ready to announce it myself. I placed hers on the counter where she always stood. I placed mine at the head of the table where I always sat. I opened the Vivian Hart folder and set it to my right. I opened my laptop at the center of the table and cued the screen, recording to 0 seconds. I opened the notes application on my phone and confirmed the audio recording function was running. Georgia's one-party consent statute required only my own consent to record a conversation I was part of. I was part of this one. I sat down and waited. At 7:52 a.m., my phone screen lit with a text from Vivian Hart. Everything is ready on our end. Monday, 9 a.m. You have what you need. I typed back, thank you. I set the phone down and looked at the folder. The laptop, the 2 cups of coffee. The kitchen was entirely quiet. Outside the window, Atlanta was gray and cold, 38 degrees, the kind of December morning that comes in without announcement and stays all day. I had lived in this city my entire adult life. I knew its winter light. At 8:17 a.m. I heard the bedroom door open upstairs. Sandra's footsteps on the stairs were a sound I had heard thousands of times. The specific rhythm of her particular pace, the way the third step from the bottom gave slightly under her weight. The small pause at the bottom, where she always stopped to adjust to whatever the day was going to be. I had never cataloged any of it before. I was cataloging it now because it was the last morning it would sound the way it had always sounded. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, in weekend clothes, soft pants, a cardigan she had owned for years, her hair loose. She saw the 2 cups of coffee and the particular quality of stillness in the room, and she smiled slightly at the first of the automatic, comfortable reflex of a woman who had been greeted with coffee on 10,000 mornings. Then her eyes moved to the folder, then to the open laptop, then to my face. She stopped. She stood in the doorway for several seconds without speaking. I watched her process the geometry of what was in front of her. 2 cups of coffee in their usual places, a legal folder she didn't recognize, a laptop she couldn't yet read from that distance, and a husband sitting with the specific stillness of someone who has been sitting there waiting for a long time and has arrived at the end of his waiting. She came to the table and sat down. I pushed her cup toward her. I said, "On Wednesday, the 6th of November at 6:47 in the evening, you sent me a video by mistake. 3 minutes and 28 seconds. I have watched it 19 times." I turned the laptop screen to face her. I pressed play. Sandra's voice filled the kitchen, her own voice from a car on an afternoon 28 days ago even, and businesslike, discussing a timeline, and a man named Derek, and a set of assets that both of them understood to belong to a marriage she was already planning to exit. The audio was clear. The timestamp was visible in the recording's interface. I watched her face for the full 3 minutes and 28 seconds. This was the thing I had been most uncertain about, not the confrontation itself, not the legal mechanics, not the long 4 weeks of preparation. I had been uncertain about what I would see in her face when the moment arrived, and whether what I saw would be something I could bear to see. I had prepared myself for tears, or for the fractured, exposed look of a person whose private failing has been brought into the open against their will. I had not prepared for what I actually saw. Her face did not break, it set. Not the softening of someone confronted with a private grief, not the transparency of genuine shock. What moved through her expression during those 3 minutes and 28 seconds was something I can only describe as recalibration, the careful interior adjustment of a person whose situation has changed and who is already, even before the video has finished assessing the new parameters. It was the face of a plan encountering an obstacle, not the face of a love being exposed. The recording ended. The kitchen was completely silent. 14 minutes passed. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave above the counter. Sandra sat with both hands around her coffee cup without drinking from it. SI did not look at me. She looked at the table or at some point in the middle distance behind the table that existed only in whatever she was calculating. I did not speak. I did not need to. I had been waiting 28 days for this morning, and I had arrived at it with more patience than I had known I possessed. I was in no hurry for whatever came next. "Where did you get—" Sandra started. "November 6th, I said. "You called 30 seconds after you sent it. You said it was a mistake." "Richard, I've spoken with Vivian Hart. Filing happens Monday morning." The kitchen went quiet again. Sandra looked at me for the first time since she had sat down, a direct measuring look that I had not seen from her before, or had not recognized for what it was when I had seen it. In those 14 minutes of silence, I had learned more about the architecture of our marriage than I had understood across 27 years of living inside it. Then Sandra Caldwell opened her mouth, and what came out was not. Grief was not apology, was not the specific thing that a man spends 26 days quietly steeling himself to receive from someone he has spent his adult life believing he knew. What Sandra said when the silence finally ended was not what I had prepared myself for. Si did not deny. Si did not cry. Si did not make any of the moves that belong to the language of a person caught in a private, failing the collapse, the plea, the sudden transparency that arrives when concealment becomes structurally impossible. What Sandra Caldwell did was go on offense. "This marriage has been empty for years," she said. Her voice was controlled and clear, the voice she used in professional settings when she needed to establish a position before the other party had a chance to set the terms. "You were never truly present. You built this business, this reputation, this version of yourself that everyone admires, and I lived on the edge of all of it. I deserve more than being someone's afterthought in my own life." I looked at her. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my chair. "I've spoken with Vivian Hart," I said. "Filing happens Monday morning. You'll lose this house in court. Any judge in Georgia will. Vivian already has the Meridian Voss Holdings documents." He said it quietly, without inflection, the way you state a known fact in a meeting where the facts have been established and are not open to revision. Delaware registration, Nevada operating account, $340,000, 38 transfers over 14 months. Your signature on the operating account. Sandra stopped. It was a different kind of stopping than the 14 minutes before. Not the calculating stillness of someone assessing parameters, but the specific quality of silence that arrives when a person has no move left that they have not already played. He had seen it in negotiations before, the exact moment when the other party understands that whatever leverage they believed they held is not in fact in their possession. He let the silence sit for a moment. "Then the screen recording is in Vivian's possession. Any conversations you need to have with anyone, those are yours to manage." I did not say Troy's name. I did not need to. He watched something move across Sandra's face at the word anyone, a brief flicker of assessment, of triangulation. She would interpret it in whatever direction her own calculations pointed. That was, he understood entirely, her problem now. Richard stood. He carried his coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it in the way he had rinsed it every morning for 27 years. Then he walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to the spare bedroom at the end of the hall, the room where he had slept quietly and without comment on the nights over the past week when maintaining the performance in the same bed had become more than he could manage. His bag was already packed. He had done it the night before, after Sandra had gone to sleep, moving in the dark between the closet and the duffel bag, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had decided he was not going to leave anything important behind. He came back downstairs and through the kitchen without stopping, and out the front door of 14 Morningside Lane at 9:51 a.m. The November air was cold and sharp. He stood on the front steps for a single moment, looking at the street that had been his street for 26 years, the oak tree, the neighbors' houses, the specific quality of morning light on a Saturday in this particular neighborhood. Then he put the duffel bag in the trunk and got behind the wheel of the Lexus and drove toward Midtown. Terrence Caldwell was 64 years old and had been Richard's older brother for all of Richard's life. He owned a penthouse on the 31st floor of a building at 860 Peachtree. He had acquired it 3 years ago as an investment property and had been in Richard's assessment, waiting for a reason to offer it to someone without making it awkward. He had known about the situation since the first week of November, when Richard had called him from the office and spoken in the careful, clipped register of a man who is not yet ready to discuss the full dimensions of what he is managing, but needs someone to know the outline. Terrence answered the door in a weekend shirt and the expression of a man who had been expecting this knock for some time. I did not ask how it went. He handed Richard a key. "Beer's in the fridge," he said. "Thank you, Terence," I said. "Don't thank me," Terence said. "Sit down." I sat. The penthouse looked out over Midtown from the southwest, the Caldwell and Associates building visible in the middle distance Peachtree Street below the city, doing its ordinary Saturday afternoon business without reference to anything that had happened in a kitchen on Morningside Lane 4 hours ago. He sat in one of the chairs by the window and did not turn on the television or open his phone. He simply sat with the city for a while, which was what the city was for. At 4:22 p.m. his phone rang. The name on the screen was Margaret Voss, Sandra's mother. 76 years old, widowed, living in a house in Decatur she had shared with Sandra's father for 31 years before he passed. Richard and Margaret had sat across from each other at Thanksgiving tables and birthday dinners and the occasional wedding for 27 years. He had always found her direct and principled in a way that he respected without ever examining very closely. He looked at her name on the screen for a moment. Then he answered, "Richard." Her voice was measured, not the careful measure of someone composing themselves, but the quieter measure of someone who has already done that work and is now simply delivering what they came to say. "I am so deeply ashamed of my daughter. Not because she was caught, because of what she chose to do to a man who deserved better." I did not speak. He let her continue. "I've been aware of certain things for a period of time," she said. "I want you to know that I did not remain silent in order to protect Sandra. I remained silent because I was afraid of what telling the truth would cost me as a mother. That is my failure, Richard, not yours, and I am calling because I think you deserve at least one person on her side of this to say that plainly." He looked out at the Midtown skyline. The afternoon light was going already the way it goes in December early. Without ceremony, the city shifting from gray to darker gray before you've noticed the transition. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. She talked for a long time after that. And near the end of the call, just before she said goodbye, she said something that reframed everything Richard thought he had understood about how he had arrived at that kitchen table and why he specifically had been the man sitting in that chair when the moment finally came. Margaret Voss had raised Sandra alone after Sandra's father left when Sandra was 11 years old. She had spent 4 decades ensuring that her daughter turned without, not materially, not professionally, not in any of the categories that a mother who had once gone without herself would know to protect. What she told me that evening, standing in the quiet of a penthouse 31 floors above Peachtree Street, was the hardest admission she had ever made about her own failure in that long project. She had been talking for some time about Sandra's childhood, about the shape of the woman she had become, about the patterns a mother recognizes, and the ones she chooses not to name when I asked the question he had been holding since the forensic accountant's report. "Margaret, I need to ask you something directly." He kept his voice level and unhurried. "The forensic accountant told us that Sandra knew exactly how to structure the financial side of this, the LLC. The transfer amounts, the timing. It was consistent with someone who had done something like this before. Has she—" The line went quiet. Not the brief pause of a person collecting their thoughts. A longer silence, the silence of someone who has been waiting for a specific question for a long time, and now that it has arrived is deciding whether the waiting has been long enough. "Richard." Margaret's voice, when it came back, had changed in some quality he couldn't name precisely, quieter and more deliberate, as though she were setting something down after carrying it for a long time. "There was a man named Thomas Everly, Nashville, 1995. He said nothing. He let her continue. "Thomas Everly had been a pharmaceutical executive regional director for a mid-sized company, a man in his mid-50s who had been divorced once before and who had, by all available evidence, believed he was building a second life when he married Sandra in 1992. The marriage lasted 3 years. When it ended, Thomas's attorney discovered that approximately $280,000 had moved out of Thomas's accounts over the preceding 18 months, routed through an LLC that Sandra had helped establish under a name that bore no connection to either of them. The Everly family retained counsel. Sandra's family retained counsel. The matter was settled privately, without court proceedings, and Sandra signed a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of the settlement. She told me she had never been married before, I said. His voice was entirely even. I know what she told you, Margaret said. I know because I knew she told you, and I said nothing. That is one of the things I am calling to say. Margaret, was Derek Weston involved in what happened in Nashville? No. She said it without hesitation. Sandra acted entirely alone in that situation. She met Derek 3 years ago at an industry conference in Chicago, from what I understand. I think they recognized something in each other. Two people who each knew how to identify what someone has built and how to make themselves close enough to reach it. Sandra brought the experience of the Nashville structure. Derek brought the corporate architecture to make the Atlanta version harder to trace. Together, she paused. Together, they were more efficient than either of them had been operating separately. Richard stood at the window of the penthouse looking out at the midtown skyline. Terrence was somewhere behind him in the apartment, present and quiet in the particular way of a person who understands that the room is not theirs at that moment. Why are you telling me this now, Margaret? I asked. Why tonight? She answered without deflecting. Because when Sandra called me this afternoon after you left the house within the first hour, the first thing she asked me was not how to repair any of this. It was not how to protect the relationship or how to begin addressing what she had done to you. The first thing she asked was how to protect her equity position in the Ansley Park property. And I understood, sitting with that question, that I have spent 27 years protecting a pattern of behavior in my daughter that I told myself was complexity. It was not complexity, and you deserved to know it before this began, not after. There was a long silence on the line between them. Then Margaret said, I'm sorry, Richard. For what that is worth from where I'm standing. It's worth something, he said. Thank you for calling. He ended the call and set the phone on the kitchen counter. Terrence came into the living room from wherever he'd been and sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the city glittered in the December dark, indifferent and continuous the way cities always are. You know what Dad would say, Terrence said finally. Yeah. I looked at the skyline. Maintain. He would. Terrence paused. He'd also say that you're allowed to feel it first, before you go back to maintaining. I nodded. He went out onto the balcony. The air at 31 floors was cold and direct, with the particular edge of a December night in Georgia that reminds you winter is real here even when it is mild. He stood at the railing and looked at the city, the towers, the movement on the streets, far below the specific grid of lights that was Midtown Atlanta at 9 o'clock on a Saturday, a city he had lived in and built a life in and loved in the unself-conscious way of someone who has never had to examine the love because it has always simply been there. He cried. Not dramatically, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that arrives quietly when you have been holding something at arm's length for long enough that your arms finally give out. He was not crying for Sandra. He understood that clearly in the way that you can sometimes understand things precisely because you are feeling them fully. He was crying for Thomas Everly, whom he had never met, who had stood in a version of the same place in 2011. He was crying for the specific, disorienting recognition of having been not a man failed by love, but a target evaluated by method, identified, approached, and scheduled with the particular patience of someone operating a long game. That understanding produces a different category of grief than betrayal does, colder in its nature, more clarifying in its effect. Thomas Everly, Nashville, 2011. 2 different cities, 2 different men. One consistent method refined across a decade of practice. He stood on the balcony until the city went quieter, until the street noise 31 floors below thinned to something approaching stillness. Then he came back inside, dried his face in the bathroom without looking in the mirror, and sat in the chair by the window with a glass of water. There was still something traveling toward him. Not from inside the legal structure, not from the forensic documents, not from the people who had been part of this story since November 6th. Something was coming from across an ocean, from a dormitory room in London, carried by his son, who had been holding his own piece of this in silence for 6 months, and had now decided that holding it alone was no longer something he was willing to do. 3 days after moving into Terrence's penthouse, Richard's phone lit up with a photograph he had taken himself. Ethan, at 17, standing on a dock in Penobscot Bay, Maine, squinting against the afternoon sun, holding a coffee cup that was too big for him, grinning at something just outside the frame. They had driven the coast of Maine together that summer, the two of them, a trip Richard had suggested, and Ethan had agreed to with the particular enthusiasm of a 17-year-old who understood, without having to articulate it, that this was something worth doing before the next phase of his life began. Richard had kept that photograph on his phone for 4 years without ever moving it to a folder or archiving it anywhere. It had always simply been there near the top of the camera roll, the way certain things stay near the top of your mind without deliberate effort. He let the phone ring once before he answered. "Dad." Ethan's voice came from 6 time zones away, quiet in the way of a person who has been sitting with something for a long time and has finally decided to bring it into the open. "I know. Uncle Terrence told me you moved out." "I know he did," I said. A brief pause. "I need to tell you something. I should have told you in June." I sat down in the chair by the window and said nothing. Outside Midtown, Atlanta was going about its Sunday afternoon without urgency. He waited. "When I started at UCL, so," Ethan said, "you set up a read-only linked account so I could monitor the education fund directly. You said you wanted me to understand how money works, learn to watch it, not just use it. You said that was how you'd learned." His voice carried something underneath the words. Not quite embarrassment, not quite guilt, but the specific register of someone delivering information they have been holding too long and are relieved to finally put down. It was still active in June. I checked it the way I always did, and there was a transfer I didn't recognize. $47,000 going to an account I had never seen before. Richard did not speak. "I called Mom," Ethan continued. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe it was something to do with the business or with tax planning or with something I didn't understand. I called her and I asked her what the transfer was." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Richard to understand what his son was about to say. She said. Ethan stopped, started again. "She said that you were under enormous pressure with the Buckhead development and that she didn't want me adding to that by raising something that probably had a simple explanation. She asked me if I could hold off on mentioning it to you directly. She said she'd look into it and follow up with me." "She didn't follow up," I said. "She didn't follow up." "Did you believe her?" I asked, when she said that. The pause was careful and honest. "I believed I wanted to believe her," Ethan said. "She sounded completely certain. She always sounds completely certain. And I told myself that I didn't have the full picture, that I was probably misreading a routine transaction, that bringing it to you would create unnecessary stress over something that was probably nothing." Another pause. "I knew it wasn't probably nothing. I just decided to act like it was." I sat with that for a moment. Then he told his son the truth, not all of it, because not all of it was his son's weight to carry, but enough. Enough for Ethan to understand the scope of what had been happening Enough for him to understand why the transfer he had seen in June was what it was, enough for him to place his own piece of the story in its correct position within the larger structure. He told it plainly and without editorializing, the way you give someone information they need, rather than information shaped to produce a particular effect. Ethan was quiet for a long time after Richard finished. Across 6 time zones in a student dormitory in Bloomsbury that Richard had helped him move into 3 years ago, his son sat with the weight of what had just been given the correct name. "I'm sorry, Dad." His voice, when it came back, was measured in the way of a young man working hard to stay in control of what he's feeling. "I should have called you in June. Whatever I was afraid of, I should have called you. She put you in a position that wasn't yours to be in," I said. "She gave you one piece of information, asked you to stay quiet about it, and made you responsible for protecting something you didn't have the context to evaluate. That is not a fair thing to put on a 21-year-old. Do you understand the difference between that and a failure on your part?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "I hear you. I need you to actually hear it," I said. "Not just say you do." A beat. "I hear it, Dad. I do." They stayed on the phone for 2 hours after that. Not about the LLC or the lawyers or the documents in Vivian Hart's conference room about London. About the economics paper Ethan was finishing before the Christmas break. About whether he wanted to come home for the holiday or stay in the city for a few days. First, about a professor he was working with on a research project he found genuinely interesting. Ordinary things. The texture of his son's actual life, which was real and ongoing and completely independent of everything that had happened in Atlanta in the past month. It was, Richard realized at some point in the second hour, the most genuinely present he had been in a conversation since November 6th. Near the end, Ethan said, "Dad, are you going to be okay?" Richard looked out the window at the city. "I'm going to be exactly okay," he said. "And so are you. Okay." Ethan's voice carried something that was almost but not quite relief. "Okay." After they hung up, Richard set the phone on the windowsill and looked at the Atlanta skyline for a while. It looked different than it had looked a month ago, not smaller, not diminished, but more honestly proportioned. He could see it more clearly now that he was looking at it from a different floor and a different chair. The people who loved him had each been carrying a separate piece of this in isolation. Carol, who had hired a private investigator and waited for something she could bring to him. Terence, who had offered a key and a chair and the particular mercy of not asking unnecessary questions. Earl, who had pointed at 2 chairs on a porch in Savannah and listened without interrupting. Ethan, who had sat in London for 6 months with a transaction he didn't understand, trying to protect both of his parents simultaneously by protecting neither of them adequately. I did not yet know that one final piece was still moving toward him, not from anyone who loved him, and not from anyone he had expected. It was coming from inside Sandra's own professional world, from a man with careful eyes who had once looked at him across a holiday party in a way that at the time he had not understood at all. Troy Simmons showed up on a Sunday morning with a brown paper bag from the original Pancake House on Peachtree Road, and the expression of a man who had been losing an argument with his own conscience for longer than he was comfortable admitting. Richard had been up since 6. He had made coffee and sat at the window watching the city come into its Sunday morning traffic, thinner than any other day, the particular unhurried quality of Midtown, at 8 a.m. when most of the building's residents were still asleep. He had been in Terrence's penthouse for 9 days. The sharpness of the first few days had settled into something more sustainable, a lower-grade weight he was learning to carry at a manageable altitude. The knock came at 9:41. He opened the door and said nothing. He simply pulled it wider and stood aside, which Troy took as the invitation. It was not a warm one, but an honest one. Troy came in and stood in the center of the living room without moving toward any of the chairs. He was holding the paper bag in one hand. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this visit several times and was now discovering that the rehearsed version was insufficient. "I'm not here for Sandra," Troy said. "I'm here because I owe you an apology and I've owed it since March. Richard looked at him. I did not speak. Troy was a corporate attorney by profession, which meant he was accustomed to choosing his words with precision and delivering them without visible uncertainty. The version of him standing in the penthouse living room that morning had neither of those qualities. What he had instead was the particular undisguised quality of a man who has decided finally to stop managing an impression and simply tell the truth. I wasn't her partner in this, Troy said. I want to be clear about that. That afternoon in the car, Sandra thought she had ended the call to Derek before I got in the passenger seat. She hadn't. I heard the tail end of a conversation that gave me more than enough to understand what was happening. The context, the timeline, the scope of it. He paused. And I froze. Richard listened. I told myself it wasn't my place to insert myself into your marriage. I told myself I didn't have the complete picture, and that acting on incomplete information would do more harm than good. I told myself there was still a chance I had misread it. Troy's jaw tightened slightly. Those were excuses, Richard. Every one of them. I had heard enough. I made a choice to do nothing with it, and I've had to sit with that choice for 9 months. Yvette found out 3 months ago what I had been sitting on, he continued. When I told her, or when she worked it out, which is closer to what actually happened, she told me that if I didn't come here and say this directly, she would come herself. She said it would not be a gentle conversation. A brief pause. She meant it. Yvette generally means what she says. Richard stood by the door for a moment, looking at Troy across the room. He was thinking about Thanksgiving, about the table, about Carol refilling Sandra's wine glass, about Troy passing the rolls and making a joke about the gravy, and sitting in the chair across from Richard, with 9 months of knowledge already behind his eyes. You were her friend first, I said. I understand the position that puts a person in. It's not a comfortable one, and it doesn't have a clean answer. He held Troy's gaze steadily. What I'm not ready to forgive yet is the Thanksgiving table, sitting across from me with what you knew for an entire evening. But I'm not asking you to settle that today. That's between you and your own conscience. Troy nodded. He accepted that without argument or justification, which was the correct response, and Richard noticed it. What do you need from me? Troy asked. Honesty, I said. If you are ever officially asked to account for what you heard in a deposition in any formal context, I need you to tell the truth. Done, Troy said, without hesitation, without qualification. He set the paper bag on the kitchen counter and left. Richard stood in the apartment after the door closed and looked at the bag. Pancakes from the original pancake house, which had been his standing Sunday breakfast order for 15 years, and which Troy had known about because he had sat across from him at a dozen Sunday brunches over the years. It was a small gesture, not large enough to address what needed addressing, but not nothing either. He put the coffee on to reheat and opened the bag and ate at the kitchen counter, looking out at the city which continued its Sunday morning without reference to any of it. He was still sitting at the counter at 2:15 when his phone rang. Vivian, a man named Philip Gaines contacted our office on Friday, she said. He is the chief financial officer at Meridian Pharmaceutical, Sandra's employer. He came to us in the capacity of a whistleblower. Under Georgia's whistleblower protection statutes, he is legally protected in making this disclosure, and he has done this through proper channels. A brief pause for precision. He alleges that Sandra used her executive position and access to company resources to facilitate financial misconduct. He has a banker's box of documents. He asked to meet with you directly, with counsel present. Richard absorbed that. I've met him once, he said. A holiday party, 2 years ago at Sandra's company event. He remembers the meeting, Vivian said. He says there is a pattern that extends beyond what we've already documented. I'd like you in the office Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. I'll be there, I said. He ended the call and set the phone on the counter beside the empty paper bag. Philip Gaines. He pulled the face from the memory, a quiet man in his mid-50s conservative suit, standing slightly apart from the main cluster of the holiday party, in the way of someone who observes rooms more than he performs for them. They had spoken for perhaps 6 minutes, a polite, unremarkable exchange about the commercial real estate market that Richard had essentially forgotten by the time he drove home that evening. What he had not forgotten, though he had not understood it at the time, was the way Philip Gaines had looked at him across that room, a long, careful, measuring look that had carried something in it he had not been equipped to name. He was beginning to name it now. It was the look of a man who already knew something and was deciding in real time what he was going to do with it. Philip Gaines arrived at the Hart and Whitfield conference room with a banker's box and the composure of someone who has spent weeks arriving at a difficult decision and is now simply executing it. Richard had been there since 9:45. He was seated at the long conference table with a glass of water he had not touched when Vivian led Philip in and made the introduction. Philip Gaines was 55 years old, compact, careful in his movements, wearing a dark suit and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been in professional environments long enough to know how to hold a room without filling it unnecessarily. Richard recognized him immediately from the holiday party 2 years ago. The careful eyes were the same. So was the measuring quality of the attention he directed at whoever was in his immediate vicinity. They shook hands. Philip set the banker's box on the table and sat across from Richard. Courtney Walsh took her usual position at the end of the table with a legal pad and said nothing. Vivian sat to Richard's left and opened the meeting without ceremony. "Mr. Gaines," she said, "please begin where you began with us on Friday." Philip folded his hands on the table. "I've been the chief financial officer at Meridian Pharmaceutical for 4 years," he said. 7 months ago, during a routine audit review, I identified a series of consultancy payments being made to an external entity that had no corresponding services documented in any of our vendor records. The entity was called Meridian Voss Holdings. He paused. I recognized the name Weston when I traced the beneficial ownership. Derek Weston had been introduced to our company as an outside advisor on a technology integration project approximately 18 months before I found the payments. Sandra Caldwell had been the executive who brought him in. I said nothing. He was listening in the way he had learned to listen over 30 years of negotiations fully, without organizing his response before the other person had finished. I began researching Derek Weston's professional background independently, Philip continued. I contacted a former colleague in Houston who works in pharmaceutical compliance. We'd been at the same firm 15 years ago. He mentioned without being prompted a situation from several years back involving a man who matched Derek's description and method of operation. An LLC registered in a different state. Structured transfers below the Bank Secrecy Act's reporting threshold. A signatory at the target company who had executive-level access. He paused again. $410,000. The matter settled privately. The victim signed a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of the settlement. Vivian looked at Richard briefly. I did not change his expression. I found a second case through a contact in Charlotte, Philip said. Different company, different shell entity name, same structure, same threshold management, same geographic distance between the LLC's registration state and the operating account, same executive-level access at the target organization. $290,000, also settled privately, also sealed. Why wasn't he prosecuted? I asked. In either case, Philip answered directly. Both victims' families chose private settlement over litigation. In exchange for payment, they signed ND. As that prevented them from making any public disclosure about Derek Weston or the circumstances of the settlement. More importantly, from a criminal prosecution standpoint, Every individual transfer in both cases, as in yours, was structured below the $10,000 currency transaction report threshold established by the Bank Secrecy Act. No single transaction triggered mandatory reporting, without a financial institution flagging the pattern, and without the victims willing to testify publicly. The cases didn't reach a prosecutable threshold. He stayed deliberately and consistently inside the legal gray zone. Richard absorbed that. The legal gray zone. Not innocent, operating at the precise edge of what the law requires to take action, and staying on the legal side of it by design. Sandra's role across these situations, Philip continued, appears consistent. She understood how to structure the financial architecture, the LLC formation, the transfer, sizing, the timing, distribution. That experience predates Derek Weston's involvement in your situation. What Derek brought was the corporate advisory cover, a legitimate professional relationship with the target organization that provided access and explained his presence. Together, they were significantly more operationally efficient than either had been individually. He paused. I want to be clear that this is my assessment based on the documentation I have reviewed. I am not a lawyer, and I would defer to counsel on the legal characterization. Your assessment is consistent with our own forensic findings, Vivian said. Courtney Walsh rose from her chair and placed 3 manila folders on the center of the conference table in a row. Each was labeled on the tab with a single word: Houston, Charlotte, Atlanta. Richard looked at the 3 folders. He looked at them for long enough that the room was quiet. 3 cities, 3 situations. One method applied and refined across several years to 3 different men who had each built something real and been approached in the same way by the same operational logic, wearing different faces. His name was at the bottom of the list. The most recent. The one that had not yet reached a settlement. The one that still had a shape that could be altered. We are now in a significantly strengthened position with respect to settlement negotiations, Vivian said. The pattern documentation substantially changes the leverage calculation. But there is a decision that belongs to you, Mr. Caldwell. She held his gaze steadily. How far do you want to pursue this in a formal capacity? We can use this material to maximize your civil settlement outcome. Alternatively, we can make it available to the relevant authorities and allow the legal process to determine its own course. These are not mutually exclusive, but the sequence matters, and it is your call. Give me 24 hours, I said. He walked out of the Peachtree Tower at 11:45 into December air that was cold and direct and requiring no interpretation. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street for a moment, the ordinary Tuesday morning movement of the city people walking between buildings without any particular awareness of what had just been laid out on a conference table 16 floors above them. Houston, Charlotte, Atlanta. 3 folders. 3 men. He thought about all 3 of them, 2 he had never met, 1 he knew by looking in a mirror. He thought about the specific understanding that had arrived when he saw his own name at the bottom of that list. This had never been a story about love. Not from Derek's side, and perhaps not entirely from Sandra's. What it had been across 3 cities and several years was a method, a business. Run with patience and precision by people who understood exactly what they were doing. There was still one thing he needed to settle before he gave Vivian his answer. Not a legal question. A question about what kind of man he intended to be when all of this was finally behind him. He had learned from a man tending a winter garden on Abercorn Street in Savannah that the answer to that question and the answers of the legal question are not always the same. Richard gave Vivian his answer in 24 hours as promised. He had spent one night sitting with a decision he already knew, waiting for it to settle into something he could carry forward without looking back. He walked into Hart and Whitfield at 9 the following morning and sat across from Vivian without a folder or a notepad. I did not need either. Full financial recovery through civil settlement, he said. Complete cooperation with any formal investigation if the relevant authorities request it. Philip's documentation will be available. No direct criminal pursuit initiated from my side. My focus is Ethan's stability and the protection of what I've built. The consequences will find their own path. Vivian set her pen down and looked at him directly. That is the most strategically and emotionally intelligent decision I've heard in my office in a long time, she said. Let's get to work. Sandra's attorney contacted Hart and Whitfield 4 days later, requesting to open settlement negotiations. The tone of the communication was notably different from what it might have been 2 weeks earlier, before Philip Gaines had carried a banker's box into a conference room and placed 3 manila folders on a long table. Philip's documentation had changed the leverage calculation entirely. Sandra's side now knew that Richard had documented evidence of a pattern connecting Derek Weston to 2 prior situations in other cities, that a company CFO had come forward as a whistleblower, and that the full financial picture was considerably more detailed than a simple marital asset dispute. The negotiating posture that Sandra's counsel had apparently planned to take was no longer available to them. The weeks between December and February moved with the particular quality of a situation that has been handed to professionals slowly, procedurally, without drama, in the way that legal proceedings always move when both sides have concluded that the outcome is not going to be changed by theatrics. In late January, Vivian called with a piece of information that had not originated from any document. Derek Weston has ceased all contact with Sandra, she said. She has attempted to reach him on multiple occasions since early December. He has not responded to any of them. A brief pause. When the operational plan failed, he removed himself. No explanation, no communication. He simply stopped answering. I sat with that for a moment. There was no satisfaction in it, not the kind he might have anticipated anyway. It was simply the final piece of the portrait, the last detail that completed the picture of exactly what kind of thing this had been from the beginning. February 11th arrived cold and overcast, the kind of Atlanta winter morning that could not decide whether it intended to stay or move on. The mediation center on Piedmont Road occupied a neutral office suite designed to feel like neither side's territory, pale walls, round table chairs of identical weight on both sides. I sat with Vivian and Courtney Walsh to his left. Sandra sat across with her attorney, a man Richard did not know. I did not look at him when he entered. I did not require her to. Vivian presented the settlement structure clearly and without commentary. Sandra will not be required to produce a cash payment for the dissipated marital assets, she said. The $340,000 in marital funds transferred to Meridian Voss Holdings over the 14-month period will be offset directly against Sandra's proportional share of the equity proceeds from the sale of the Ansley Park property. What she would have been entitled to receive from the home's equity, she will not receive. The mathematics are straightforward and auditable. The result, the Ansley Park house would be listed and sold, with the net equity distributed under the offset formula. Richard's investment portfolio, established through 30 years of separate professional income, remained intact under Georgia's equitable distribution framework. His pension was unaffected. Sandra received her proportional share of the remaining marital assets after the offset was applied, a significantly reduced figure from what she would have received without the dissipation finding. The settlement also included a non-disclosure provision which Sandra's attorney had requested, and which Richard agreed to on the condition that it applied symmetrically to both parties. Richard signed at 11:43 a.m. He walked out of the mediation center and into the parking structure and sat in the Lexus for 6 minutes without starting the engine. I did not cry. I did not feel the particular release of a man who has won something. What he felt was the specific, quieter quality of an ending, the closing of a thing that had been dying for a long time before it was finally allowed to stop. He picked up his phone. "It's done," he said when Ethan answered. "Are you okay, Dad?" "Getting there." A pause. "That's enough for now," Ethan said. Richard started the engine and drove out into the gray February light. 31 years after he had opened Caldwell and Associates, with a borrowed desk in a building he could not yet afford, and a name that meant nothing to anyone in Atlanta, he had walked out of a mediation room having protected what he had spent those 31 years building. Not perfectly, not without loss, but intact in the ways that defined what the thing had been built for: the work, the portfolio, the capacity to continue. What it felt like was the end of something that had taken a very long time to complete its dying. A grief that had nothing to do with winning or losing. He had learned in the past 3 months that those two things were rarely the same. There was still one thing he had not done, not legal, not procedural, not a conversation that needed to happen. Something that could only happen in motion. He signed up for the Peachtree Road Race the following morning.